commercial real estate. And our mission every single day is to create amazing values for our clients, colleagues, and communities. And this commercial real estate virtual series is just one example on how we're implementing that mission. Now I'd like to introduce my co-host, Wesley Cox. Wesley Cox is a CCIM and he's a key member of the HANA team here at SVN. Wes and I and the entire SVN team would like to welcome you to our 11th annual Commercial Real Estate Forum virtual series. Our normal venue for this forum is normally held at Salisbury University every single spring. However, due to the current environment, we are shifting gears to create several virtual commercial real estate forums that will be held over the next few weeks as we transition through this recovery. We've invited several local, regional, and national dynamic speakers, which will enlighten you on the economic forecast, best practices, trends, and opportunities on shifting gears in this changing commercial real estate market. In order to make this forum as interactive as possible, we welcome and encourage your questions. So go ahead and please type any questions in the Q&A box down below, and we will ask those of our keynote speaker as much as we can get through. Now, I would like to turn it over to Wesley to welcome one of our sponsors. Wes.
Thanks, Brent, and thank you everyone for attending. Good morning. We're very excited this morning. We have a great speaker, our keynote speaker for our virtual series, which has traditionally been our keynote speaker for our in-person live event at Salisbury University. Doing things a little different this time. Our keynote speaker goes right in the middle and sit in the end. You know, we keep them in the end during the live event so no one leaves in the middle of it and they hang around for the best guy. But here for scheduling and for a variety of other reasons, we have him right here in the middle. So before we get to that, I have the pleasure of introducing one of our sponsors today, Jim Hartstein with the insurance market. His family started the insurance market. Jim and his family, brothers and nephews, are now the second generation, kind of taken over, leading the charge into the future. Jim has been a valuable partner to us here at SVN Miller Commercial Real Estate, providing services to many of our tenants, many of our shopping center, and various other products, providing insurance for them. So we're happy to have Jim on board. Jim's been a valuable sponsor for the last few years for us, and we continue to look forward working with Jim in the future. So Jim's going to share, before introducing our speaker, Jim's going to share a few things that he's noticed within the world he lives in and provide some valuable insight for us today on the insurance world. So Jim, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wes, for those kind words. And Brent, thank you very much for you and your team putting together this awesome event, bringing a lot of value to folks, and that's first class. I appreciate you having me. So a little bit about us. We are actually a third generation independently owned insurance broker with 3 offices across the Delmarva Peninsula. We actually specialize in helping our clients to implement truly innovative strategies which will reduce their bottom line and maximize their insurance spend, which can also help reduce risk. So what I wanted to share, I reached out to Brent and Wes yesterday. I heard some interesting information from what is known as the Council, which is a property and casualty insurance thought leadership group when they put out their Q1 2020 property and casualty survey. What we're seeing, what they said in their report, and what we're seeing actually boots on the ground, we continue to move from what has been a very soft market for the last 10 or 15 years to a hardening market. Now, what does that mean? It means premiums are increasing. It means underwriting appetites are decreasing. Not necessarily the best news as it relates to cost, but what we've seen is roughly a 9.5% increase in Q1, and I'm seeing actually boots on the ground. I'm seeing that come to fruition. In particular, on the commercial property rate side of things, I've read some projections that are as low as 10%. And then some projections which are saying that we could even reach a 30% increase in rate for high catastrophic areas. So think if you're down here on the shore, think hurricanes, think high wind areas. We could be looking at some significant rate increases there. So the question becomes, what can you do about it, right? What options do we have to either offset or minimize the negative impact associated with the market? First and foremost, shop your coverages. But when I say shop your coverages, make sure you're working with a broker, an independent broker who has a process, has a system to properly position you in the market. The reality is underwriters, insurance companies, they still want to write best in class. They still want to write profitable business. They still want to write property that's not going to have losses. And what can we do to help mitigate that is tell a good story, help you implement some good loss control tactics and strategies, which can get you more favorable terms and conditions. So basically, you need a broker who's going to help sell you to an insurance company, again, for that preferred price. Consider sweeping changes to your insurance program design. All right, what I mean by that is look at your property values hard. Are these property values accurate, or have they inflated over time? Run replacement cost estimators. Dive into the numbers because, as many of you know, the devil is very much in the details as it relates to insurance and then your overall premiums. Here's a little. This is maybe the master's level here, but explore the difference between what we call functional replacement cost and traditional replacement cost. This is a conversation that I'm having with clients more and more frequently. Basically, if you had a loss to a property, what's your intended next step? Would you rebuild this, or would it look different? And let's break that down and have a conversation. Last but not least, this might be low-hanging fruit, but folks will often come back to, should I look at higher deductibles? Yes, if it makes sense. Word of caution there is sometimes if you take that deductible up from 5 to 10 to 25 to 50, the juice may not be worth the proverbial squeeze. So explore all those things. If you haven't had that second cup of coffee, I may have bored you with too much insurance. So I'll go ahead and get to the nitty gritty and introduce our keynote speaker. So we have the pleasure today of hearing from Mr. Anirban Basu. Mr. Basu, if you had the opportunity to hear him speak, is a wonderful presenter, always very entertaining, always very enlightening, and always takes a very realistic but an optimistic view, which we're happy to hear more from him in detail today. So Mr. Basu is the chairman and CEO of the Sage Policy Group. They are an economic and policy consulting firm based in Baltimore. He has twice been recognized as one of Maryland's 50 most influential people. And he has also been named as one of Baltimore region's 20 most powerful business leaders. So Mr. Basu is very well known in the business community. Among many of his roles, he is, in addition to the Sage Policy Group, he serves as the chairman of the Maryland Economic Development Commission, is also the chief economist for several other organizations. If that weren't enough, in his free time, he is an avid James Bond novel reader. He is interested in English football, Indian cricket. So if I showed him how I bowl, I'm sure he could correct me on that. And then a fan of all Baltimore sports teams. He lives in the Baltimore area with his wife and 2 daughters. So without any further ado, I'm proud to introduce Mr. Basu, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And thank you to SVN for creating this venue. It's a privilege to be with you today. I'm going to speak for some moments. So I'm going to try to keep it to around half an hour. It might be a bit more than that. And talk about the economy and where we are in this cycle. And then I'll take some questions and answers. So please, as I'm going through the material, please use this forum to ask your questions. Wesley Cox, I believe, will address those questions to me after I'm done with my comments. It is a Lord of the Rings themed presentation today, Return of the Economist. You will see that theming throughout the presentation. many ways to start a presentation, of course. We could recite the Pledge of Allegiance, engage in prayer, perhaps sing the national anthem. I'm going to start, of course, with the ring verse, which says, 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness find them. You will see this organizational framework throughout this webinar: 9, 7, 3, 1, 9 rings for the kingdom of men and women, 7 for the dwarves, 3 for the elves, 1 for the dark lord. I think you'd agree the Dark Lord's been pretty busy on Middle Earth so far in 2020. This is a graphic regarding global cumulative confirmed cases. This is what ended our splendid economic expansion. This is what ended the lengthiest economic expansion in American history. This is what has caused some angst, I'm sure, in commercial real estate, but many other segments of the economy. Good news here, of course, is that we're flattening the curve globally. Hotspots emerge all the time, of course, Brazil and Mexico, for instance, recently. But, and, you know, obviously infection rates in certain states actually have been rising as economies have been reopened, but some progress here. Now, you know, my job here is to talk about the economy. Please understand that I first and foremost view COVID-19 as a public health issue and a public health crisis. Over 100,000 Americans have lost their lives, over 400,000 people globally. But as I say, my job is to talk about the economy. And the economy had been great, terrific, tremendous. And we enter 2020 with a lot of momentum. And you know, the goal, of course, the hope is that we return to where we had been, something close to that, if not better. So we're going to talk about that, the damage that's been done to the economy by the affliction, but also the recovery to come. So let me walk through some of this. So, you know, we had this pre-existing momentum in the economy, and there was some naivete among certain economists. I mean, as late as early March, you would have heard some economists suggesting that the pre-existing momentum of the economy could see us through this public health crisis without a recession. And that was based on the notion that, for instance, we're adding a lot of jobs. This is monthly job growth in America. And we had added jobs for 113 consecutive months. Over those 113 consecutive months of job growth, we added 22 million jobs. That ended, of course, with March. And in fact, the job destruction has been so profound that I've had to index the data for March, April, and May on the right-hand axis. Because in April, we lost 20.5 million jobs. And if I wanted to graph that on one axis, all these other bars would just disappear. So March, April, May, indexed to the right in red, and then the rest of the economic history here to the left through February of 2020. So as you know, we've basically wiped out the jobs that we added during that 113-month winning streak. We have seen 43 million Americans file for initial unemployment. I'll talk more about that as I go through the presentation. But the hope, of course, is we get back to where we had been. This is, you know, where we are now. This gives you a sense of how many jobs we lost between the 12-month period from May 2019 to May of 2020. And of course, some industries were deemed essential, some non-essential. Some of us can work remotely, about 30% of us can work remotely, Americans. The rest cannot. So when you look at the job losses here, naturally they tend to be in industries that were A, deemed non-essential, and B, where social distancing means you basically have to shut down the enterprise. So the sector that lost the most number of jobs, leisure and hospitality, that's mostly hotel and restaurant employment, 6.7 million jobs lost between May of 2019 and May of 2020. The next category, retail trade, wholesale trade, transportation, and utilities, 2.8 million. That's your retail worker, for instance. But every segment of the economy has lost jobs over this period. Now, again, we're going to talk about the recovery to come. Regionally, we can see some variations as well. This is job growth, or lack thereof, as it turns out, for the 12-month period spanning from April 2019 to April of 2020. So some regions were hit harder. Detroit was hit harder. I mean, it became a major center of the epidemic. And it had lost a quarter of its jobs by April of 2020, vis-a-vis a year ago. Other communities were more reluctant to shut down their economies, kept more of their industries open. And so in places like Dallas and Phoenix, you see 8% job loss, which is still massive, of course, but less. New York Metro, of course, New York became the singular epicenter of the virus, losing 20% of its jobs from April 2019 to April of 2020. Now, in May, we added jobs, and I'll talk about that in a moment. That's one of the reasons for hope. I should have mentioned that in the previous slide. But big surprise, economists coming into Friday's jobs report, which is the May jobs report, were thinking collectively, and not me, by the way, but those who have been surveyed, for instance, those Wall Street economists believe we're going to lose around 7.5 to 8 million jobs. We ended up adding 2.5 million. So that was a miss of around 10 million jobs. Even that's bad even by economist standards. And I'll talk about why that happened as I go through this material. But it is still the case that if you look at this time, from the perspective of this time a year ago, we're way down, and we're way up in terms of unemployment. Now, here I'm graphing for you 3 rates of unemployment. Male unemployment is in blue, female unemployment is in green, and overall unemployment is in red. Now, because we added those jobs for 113 consecutive months, we just steadily pounded away at that unemployment rate, such that the unemployment rate pre-crisis was 3.5% nationally. And that was a 50-year low. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-crisis. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. That just gives you a sense of how historic this economic expansion was. Now, during the previous economic downturn, it was women who were hit harder by the downturn. Sorry, during the previous economic downturn, the Great Recession, was men who were hit harder. And you can see that in the blue line. And that's because men are disproportionately attached to industries like manufacturing and construction, and those 2 industries led job losses. Each of those sectors lost about 2 million jobs during the downturn, and we lost about 8.7 million jobs in total. So construction, manufacturing, as it turns out, were disproportionately hit hard by that downturn, and men therefore were as well. Don't get me wrong. Female unemployment also rises significantly during that period. It's just that, relatively speaking, men were hit harder. This time was different. It was women who were hit harder, because women are more likely to be attached to daycare centers, schools, leisure hospitality, retail, and also many women were on the front lines of delivering care when infection rates were spiking. An easy majority of American nurses are women. So if you think about the typical staffing model of a nursing home or in a hospital, a lot of women on those staffing models, many of them became sick as they were delivering care to others. And so they lost employment for that reason, at least temporarily. So if you look at the green line there, the unemployment rate for women above 14%, the overall unemployment rate in May was 13.3%, and it's actually a bit lower for men. So every cycle is different, every recession is different, and this one is different in many different ways. We'll talk about that. So this is unemployment rates for April for the 25 largest metropolitan areas. So you can see here the devastation. In Detroit, by April, unemployment up to 24.4%. The lowest here happens to be Minneapolis, much in the news recently, 9.2%. If you're thinking about, well, what about Maryland? Well, this is March unemployment. This is March unemployment for the 24 major jurisdictions in Maryland. I bolded Wycomico County here for obvious reasons, but unemployment low basically everywhere. Now in Worcester County, it's different. That's home to Ocean City, so we tend to have high seasonal unemployment during every part of the year except for the summer, which is too bad because these are people who are looking for work. They're Worcester County residents. They can't find jobs, and so unemployment is high. So that's one of the challenges for that part of the state's economy, is to create a year-round economy in Worcester County. But setting that aside, generally speaking, unemployment was quite low in March of 2020 throughout Maryland, 3.3% unemployment rate statewide, but that unemployment rate 1 month later was triple, 9.9%. And Wycomico County, which was sitting below 5%, 13.5% as an example. Worcester County, 22.8%. So this is where we were. The National Bureau of Economic Research, you probably heard yesterday, announced that the recession began in February. That's when we were starting our social distancing, as it turns out. The economy was actually holding up in February. But you might remember by late February, we were fist pumping and we were elbow bumping. And we were also doing the kid and play toe tap, you might remember. But the economy, I would say, didn't really feel the effect of this until roughly March 9th. With some exceptions to that. I mean, hotels were becoming emptier by that point, and some conferences, South by Southwest was canceled around that time. The NBA season is scuttled around that time. But it's really early March that a lot of this happens. March 9th is when I would say the crisis began. But no, they just said recession began in February. I know. I know. But really, it was March 9th that we became aware of how devastating this was going to be, because on that day, the Dow Jones falls more than 2,000 points. Up until that point, the financial markets in the US had held up pretty well. But on March 9th, 2,000 point dip on the Dow. And that was at that time the largest point decline in Dow Jones history. But we set new records on March 12th and then again on March 16th. It was not until March 11th that the Utah Jazz are ushered away from the basketball court when their all-star center, Rudy Gobert, is diagnosed with COVID-19. Just a few days later, his fellow all-star, Donovan Mitchell, guard forward, the Utah Jazz have a very good team, was also diagnosed. And again, that's around the time. So it was around that time, early to mid-March, that really things start to change economically. And so by April, you see this. That previously low unemployment associated with significant wage growth. I mean, as business operators, what was your leading issue coming into this crisis? Was it not a lack of talent that you could retain and recruit? Wasn't that the biggest issue facing American business at that time? A skills shortage, a worker shortage? When you've got 7.3 million available job openings and you've got 5.8 million people unemployed coming into the crisis, wages are going to go higher because you're chasing after talent. Amazon is not a 501c3. It's not a charitable organization. It's for profit. It's shareholder owned. They raised the minimum wage to $50 an hour. Why? Because that's evidence of a strong labor market. So what do we have so far? We had lots of job growth, lots of wage growth. Guess what people do when they have a job and they're making more money at their job? They spend it. This is US retail sales, which were fabulous until they weren't. If you look at the last two skinny bars here, you can see a decline in retail sales activity for March and April of this year. We're still waiting for the May data. We've already sustained or suffered the bankruptcies of J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, and most recently J.C. Penney and others. And there'll be other bankruptcies. I mean, one of the things that I will say about this is that, yes, there's a recovery to come, and I'll talk about that, but we're going to be left with a lot of empty storefronts and a lot of empty office suites coming out of this crisis. Because at any given moment in the economy, irrespective of how strong that economy is, you've got some marginal players. And what this crisis has done is it's served to wash away a lot of those marginal players who were, in some cases, occupying storefronts and occupying office suites, so on and so forth. Well, we'll talk more about that in a moment. Of course, we're focused very much on commercial real estate today. So, but this is where we were, in some sense, through February pre-crisis. Here was the miracle: the lack of inflation. You have a 50-year low in unemployment. So, I mean, you remember from school, one of the lectures was about the Phillips curve, which says very simply, if unemployment goes down, inflation goes up, that's it. If you had an economics professor and they asked you on that, that was not an essay question. It was not, hey, tell me your feelings. How do you feel? What are your emotions surrounding the Phillips curve? Do you really believe that when unemployment falls, inflation goes up? No, that was no such question. It was not a touchy-feely question. It was true or false. True or false? When unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. True. Thank you. Next question. So if I tell you there's a 50-year low in unemployment, and if I also tell you that during the previous crisis, the Great Recession, the Federal Reserve creates mounds of new money supply, driving its balance sheet from $800 billion to $4.5 trillion. Federal Reserve's balance sheet today is around $7 trillion. But if I tell you that all this money supply creation, low unemployment, yeah, you bet you're predicting inflation, except it didn't happen. So this is inflation as measured by the core CPI, the core consumer price index. There's another measure of inflation that's very popular at the Federal Reserve, the core PCE deflator, personal consumption expenditures deflator. Suggests that inflation has been running recently at around 1.7%, at least was last year. Now you can see that in the short term, look at the April figure here, we have some disinflation. Inflation has been falling. Interest rates have been falling. And today I'm looking at a 10-year treasury along with you of 0.784%. That's the second update. 0.784% on the 10-year. Low interest rates. Now, low interest rates are not purely benign. Some of this is a reflection, of course, of fear in the market. So people are willing to sit in safer assets without garnering much interest. In fact, in inflation-adjusted terms, it's a negative return. Obviously, low interest rates make things difficult for retirees, people trying to save for retirement. Makes it difficult for people who run life insurance companies, pension funds, because it's difficult to generate income from investments. But if you're trying to perpetuate a borrow and spend, borrow and invest cycle, low interest rates, of course, are brilliant. And we enjoyed these low interest rates in part because we didn't have an inflation problem. Indeed, even as we were marching toward that 50-year low in unemployment last year, the Federal Reserve was cutting rates. You'll remember they cut rates not once, not twice, but thrice last year, the so-called mid-cycle adjustment, which turned out to be a late cycle adjustment. So perfect. If you think about the environment for commercial real estate, what would you want? You'd want a low cost of capital, lots of job growth, lots of users of space. That's exactly what we had. Property values on the rise. Now, this is residential property values. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. So this equilibrium that we enjoyed pre-crisis led to a growth in wealth as well. I mean, if you speak to realtors or had spoken to realtors prior to the crisis, what would they have told you? I got all kinds of people looking for homes. I got baby boomers looking to downsize. I got millennials looking to move out of apartments into homes. My problem is I got nothing to show them. Inventory of unsold homes is low. So when demand is high and supply is low, guess what you get? You get rising values and therefore more wealth to support those rising incomes. Fabulous. Look at US residential building permits coming out of 2019 and 2020. They were surging. A lot of that was single family permits because home builder confidence was at a 20-year high coming into the crisis. Why? Because they could see supply is low, demand is high. There's an opportunity for me as a home builder to meet unmet demand. A lot of the capital this cycle has flowed into multifamily construction, apartment construction. And I'm not saying that we're still not seeing a lot of that. We are. But the first-time home buyer was back as a segment. But you can see, of course, COVID-19 has ruined that momentum and that residential building permits have been declining recently. But this is the way the economy was. And the underlying demographics are still there. We still have a lot of 20-somethings heading into their 30s. And that translates into more demand for homes ultimately. And then, of course, the stock market itself. I've got the Dow Jones Index to the right, the NASDAQ and the S&P to the left. By the way, the NASDAQ, as I was speaking, just at another all-time high. I entitled this slide, but it goes to Elvin as a nod to the fact that Lord of the Rings has lots of elves, one of whom is played by the phenomenal Orlando Bloom. He hangs out with models, so my sources at TMZ tells me. But also to fully understand the title of the slide, you'd have to harken back to a movie that came out in 1984 called This Is Spinal Tap. And if you understand that reference, this becomes hilarious. But if you don't, that's fine. The point is everything going for us. And again, this naivete among economists, that pre-existing momentum, could carry us through. No way. And we'll talk about why that was not the case in a moment. But and here's another thing. Even as the headline numbers for the economy, unemployment and job growth, all that was good, inflation, there are some vulnerabilities building up in the economy. Let's talk about those. Let's talk about 7 of those, in fact. So I've done the 9, here comes the 7. So 1, not all segments of the economy were participating in the expansion. So I'll give you some examples. Agriculture. Agriculture was weak as a performer coming into this. A lot of farmers have been taking a lot of debt, dealing with the impact of trade wars and low soybean prices, low corn prices. Single-family home construction has not been that strong. It was about to take off based on the building permits data. It's a leading indicator. I intend to build. I'm seeking permission from a government entity to build. Manufacturing, another example. Any reading below 50 here means that manufacturing is in recession. Well, for 5 months late last year, manufacturing was in recession. Why? Trade war with the Chinese. The waning strength of the US auto sector, which really peaked in 2016. The issues at Boeing. A strong US dollar, which among other things frustrates US export growth and invites in more imports. Now, what happened late last year? We signed a first phase trade deal with China. We get ratification of the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, the new NAFTA. We get Boris Johnson's resounding victory in the United Kingdom. And that means that we have more certitude regarding Brexit. When was the last time you talked about Brexit? You might have been talking about Boris Johnson during this pandemic, but not Brexit, probably. So all of a sudden, all that uncertainty that was revolving around the US manufacturing sector was beginning to abate. And all of a sudden, by January, the reading comes above 50, 50.9, as it turns out. We're out of manufacturing recession. But then with the supply chain disruptions emerging from China, late in 2019 and 2020, with growing trade tensions, with the demand for goods shattered around the world, you can see US manufacturing back in recession, but there was that pre-existing vulnerability, whether with respect to Boeing or other segments of the manufacturing industry, but by far, and I think this is very important for Marylanders to think about all the time, by far our leading source of vulnerability is debt, including federal debt or the national debt. And the reason I call out Maryland is because obviously our state is driven disproportionately by federal government outlays. When the federal government ramps up its debt, in some sense, it's good for Maryland because the federal government is spending more money, and a disproportionate amount of that money ends up in Maryland, as it turns out. This is the federal deficit as a percentage of GDP. Now, the dark blue colored bars here are forecasts from Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan. This is pre-COVID-19 forecast. And last year in nominal terms, if you added inflation plus real economic growth, which was 2.3% last year, America grows in nominal terms 4%. Our federal budget deficit as a percentage of GDP was 4.6%. So you take away that federal deficit spending, there is no economic growth in America, not statistically. And you can see the forecast here was even pre-CARES Act and all these other forms of stimulus from the federal government, deficits, large deficits, as far as the eye could see. The consumer has taken on more debt over time. Here I'm showing you various flavors of consumer debt, mortgages, student loans, credit cards. And that's why, very early in the crisis, people said, send me a check, please. Because not only can I not make my rent payment here in early April, but I got a credit card bill coming, I got an auto loan payment coming, I got a student loan bill coming. My goodness, that's a vulnerability. Corporate debt has never been greater. You say, Anirban, did you not just talk about a booming stock market? Undoubtedly, corporate earnings have been strong to justify that market boom. And yeah, corporate earnings have been strong. So haven't companies had the cash to pay down debt, especially because we cut corporate tax rates in late 2017? Yeah. So what are you showing here? I'm showing you what happened. I'm showing you that corporate debt went up. But how? Well, this is what happens when you buy back your shares every year. You issue debt to buy back the shares, debt goes up, equity goes down. And I get the mathematics. I buy back shares, there are fewer shares outstanding, earnings per share goes up, stock price goes up, but you're also left with a more leveraged balance sheet. This also happens when you buy back, you buy a leading competitor. By the way, big news today in commercial real estate nationally, which was the scuttling of a merger that had been proposed involving Taubman Centers. Perhaps you've already heard about this. But that's one of the victims, that merger. And Taubman Center stock price this morning is a victim of COVID-19, as it turns out. And we'll again talk about more about the commercial real estate dynamics in a moment. But again, there were these pre-existing vulnerabilities. And I, as an economist, was predicting a recession within the next 12 to 18 months pre-COVID-19 because of these vulnerabilities, because of this indebtedness, and some other factors I'm going to talk about, like the lack of productivity growth. So ultimately, it is productivity growth that defines how rapidly a people's living standard will rise over time. Oh, you can play games. I mean, you can take on a lot of debt. You can borrow from the future and enjoy yourself today. But ultimately, from a longer-term perspective, your living standards rise with productivity. Productivity is typically measured as output per hour worked. So when I was growing up, I grew up in Kankakee County, Illinois, in the Indiana border. Sounds every bit as exciting, was every bit as exciting as it sounds. When I was growing up, they said to me, Anirban, because that's my name, America grows 3% a year in real terms. That's who we are. We're a 3% people, Anirban. You ask an economist like myself today, how much will we grow? I'll say, less than 2%. Set aside COVID-19, but 2% in real terms. Why? Well, economic growth is just productivity growth plus labor force growth. I'll pick up the third bullet here. U.S. productivity has risen at an average rate of 1.4% since 2007, compared with the 2.2% average since the year of World War II. Moreover, the labor force is not growing the way it once did, in part because baby boomers are retiring in large numbers, but also immigration policy is shifting and so on and so forth. So you put it all together, what was a 3% economy is now less than 2%. And when you've got a $23.5 trillion national debt coming into the crisis, it's hard enough to pay that back or pay that down at 3% growth in real terms. At less than 2%, even more difficult. Here's another thing to think about. A lot of us are focused right now on COVID-19 and opening up the economies. Will there be a resurgence in the fall of these kinds of things? But there are other risks coming from other parts of the world. There's still a North Korea. I mean, there's still a Middle East. There's still a France. This is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. Look where we were in 1998. Remember that? The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was decimated, Eastern Europe was regaining its freedom, and global risk was on the decline. Now, since that time, global risk has been picking up. Obviously we had 9/11, for instance, then we had the Great Recession and sort of the devastation on economies, and then trade wars and so on and so forth. But late last year, because we got that first phase trade deal with China, ratification of the USMCA, Boris Johnson resounding victory in the United Kingdom. Not saying I'm a Boris Johnson fan or not, but again, it gave us more certitude, that victory regarding Brexit and what Britain's exit from the European Union might look like economically. So actually, coming into 2020, believe it or not, global risk was actually declining based on this and other measures. But now with COVID-19, so much of the world thrown out of work, so many governments taking on more debt, with such instability and trade wars reemerging, so on and so forth, you can see here. So this makes life difficult, doesn't it? That the global trade regime is fragmenting, and nations are going their separate ways. And then finally, as a final source of vulnerability coming into this crisis, stock prices were high. This is the price-earnings ratio, the Shiller price-earnings ratio, graph back to 1980. So, I'm just trying to say very simply here that prices on the S&P 500 were high relative to the earnings of companies on the S&P 500. That's all. I'm not saying the market was priced to perfection, but it was getting close to that. And actually, as the NASDAQ now hits more than 10,000 as I'm speaking, 10,004 as I'm speaking, in some sense, that's a source of vulnerability, isn't it? Because while it's wonderful to see our portfolios come back to life and to get, that next quarterly statement is going to be more benign, what goes up can come down, what goes up a lot can come down a lot. And don't get me wrong, over the period of that bull market rally pre-COVID-19, we had a splendid decade in America economically, splendid decade. I mean, for decades, America's share of global output was in decline. And some of that was engineered. By whom? The Americans. The Americans who fashioned the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe post-World War II. Is the Americans who spent some of their own treasure to accelerate Japanese economic recovery from World War II. The goal being to transform our sworn enemies into our future trade partners, and boy, did it work. Germany today is the fourth largest economy in the world. Japan is third. Italy is eighth. But something very interesting happened in the previous decade. America's share of global output actually rose from 23% at the beginning of the decade to 25% by decade's end. Look, I know that we Americans have some dysfunctions. Our broken politics, our infrastructure, our national debts, what's been happening recently in various US cities. I get it. But look, we're less than 5% of the world's population. We're a quarter of its output. We're doing something right. We're doing something right. But does this performance, as remarkable as it is, justify this performance? This is stock market returns by country 2010 to 2019. And you can see America here in the red bar, 256%. Now, you may not agree with anything I've said so far. Not one thing. But I think one thing upon which we can agree is that a decade has 10 years. There I've said something that you agree with. Now you take 256% divided by 10. That gives you a back of the envelope calculation with respect to our annual rate of return on the stock market here. My goodness, through the roof. If you look at it in absolute terms, meaning price earnings ratios or relative terms, I mean, look at India, a country that during a bad economic year pre-COVID-19 will grow 6% in real terms, but you wouldn't know that from its stock performance. Emerging markets generally grow faster than the United States, but you wouldn't know that from the stock market performance here. So again, this was some of the pre-existing vulnerability that at least I saw coming into this crisis. And COVID-19 has, I think, fully exploited those vulnerabilities. And again, there was this naivete about, we can get through this without a recession. Nonsense, because this is just different. So I've done the 9, I've done the 7, here comes the 3. This is just different. First and foremost, this is not a demand shock like 08, 09, the Great Recession. No. In that case, the money just disappeared off of bank balance sheets, off of household balance sheets as their homes became worth less, not worthless, but worth less. So what did we do? The air came out of the balloon, money was disappearing, we put air back in the balloon. We had a troubled assets relief program to recapitalize the banks, We blew up the Federal Reserve's balance sheet to $4.5 trillion. We added, trillions of dollars liquidity to financial systems, and it worked. It worked because that fomented the lengthiest economic expansion in American history and did not generate significant inflation. But this is supply shock, not a demand shock. This is quarantines, travel bans and restrictions, closure of public places, producing factory closures, supply chain disruptions. Now, as it turns out, when you have a supply shock like this, and now people are starting to lose jobs in large numbers, say 20.5 million jobs lost in April, according to the initial release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, then that triggers a following demand shock, right? Because people don't have as much income. Though it's interesting, because of that $1,200 check that many Americans received, and because of the $600 per week federal benefit, unemployment insurance benefit on top of state unemployment insurance benefits, a lot of people have been stockpiling cash. More on that in a moment. More on that in the US savings rate in a moment. Economists, I think agree now this is the worst quarter of our lives economically. I think one hopes that this is the worst quarter. If it ever gets worse than this, I'm not going to do a webinar about it. Forecasts from various economists, the Conference Board predicting a 44.5% decline in GDP for the current quarter on an annualized basis. Now, I think these forecasts are going to be revised upward in some sense. And that's because we got that surprising May jobs report. But even if it turns out to be a 25% or 30% loss in GDP on an annualized basis, by comparison, during the worst quarter of the Great Recession in late 2008, the economy shrank 8.4%. I mean, this is the worst quarter of our economic lives. That said, we could argue that the recession is over. Anirban, what do you say? They just announced the recession began in February yesterday. How can there? Because we're recovering already. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, some workers were more vulnerable than others. If you look at the second bolded row here, this comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, employed in occupations at high risk of layoff, 46% of total employment. Who is that? That's people in food preparation. That's folks who work in restaurants. Sales and related occupations. Who are they? That's your retail sales worker. Production occupations. That's your construction worker. That's your manufacturing worker. When General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, BMW, others shutter their plants, people in production occupations are vulnerable. Installation, maintenance, repair occupations. Who's that? That's the electrician who would come to your house to repair whatever, the plumber, whomever, but you didn't invite them into your homes unless you really, really had to. So, the unemployment rate was destined to go very high, and it did, but it fell in May apparently to 13.3%. Still very high, but it went from 14.7% the previous month to 13.3%. So that's not evidence of recession, is it? That's evidence of recovery. On a week-by-week basis, fewer people are filing for initial unemployment claims or filing unemployment claims initially. You can see that. This is red chart here. So we had the week ending March 28th, where nearly 7 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance. During the week ended May 30th, 1.9 million. Now, still a big number. The blue line represents the pre-crisis trend. And this can be misleading. Here's why economists missed it, that May jobs report, predicting 8 million jobs lost when we added 2.5 million. Here's why they missed it. We can see the people who are losing their jobs. We can see that. We can't see the people who are securing new jobs, at least not right away. And so we got some hint that people were being rehired because, well, a lot of people were still filing for unemployment insurance, continuing claims. People who are currently on unemployment insurance, that actually began to fall a few weeks ago. And that's what this shows here. So people were winning jobs back. And that's wonderful. And if more people are winning jobs back than losing them, what does that tell you? Well, that's not recession. Don't get me wrong, the economy is in still very tough shape. My point is simply that we're on the mend here. And there's been a lot of debate about whether or not the recovery would be a U, a W, an L shape, a V, a Nike swoosh, a check mark. It's going to be a V, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be a V for victory. This comes from Oxford Economics. This is their global economic outlook. The red line was the January forecast. So what it shows basically is global economy expected to grow. The blue line represents the current forecast. You see that big downdraft in economic activity during the first half of 2020? Yeah, that's what we've been living through. But what do you see thereafter? And the reason I use Oxford Economics is because I have a lot of respect for their forecasts. They're terrific at this. They bring a lot of common sense to forecasting, and common sense is not common. But I'm not saying it's going to be a V because that's what Oxford Economics says. I'm saying it's going to be a V because that's what it has been when we've had previous pandemics. Now, this comes from Goldman Sachs, and too many lines on this graphical element by half. But if you just look at that light blue line there that goes way up to the top and back down, Hong Kong, 2003 SARS epidemic. The skinny black line at 0% is what? That's pre-existing rate of economic growth. That's what the economy had been doing prior to the epidemic or pandemic. So obviously, during the early stages of the pandemic, what happens? Growth goes below that pre-existing average. Of course it does. And then as more segments of the economy are affected by the pandemic, what happens? Well, if you look at that Hong Kong line there, that light blue line, things get worse before they get better, because first it's travel, and then it's retail, and then all of a sudden it's financial services and construction and manufacturing, so on and so forth. And we've seen some of that in America. But then what do you see? Pretty quickly, after about a quarter in that instance, things bounce right back. That's exactly what it's been in America. Now, it's an awkward V. A V is made up of two linear segments of equal length, right? One goes down, one goes back up. This is different. This is an awkward V. The down segment, the first segment of the V, is lengthier than the up segment. Complete recovery will take years. But the initial phase of this expansion is going to be quite robust. And the May jobs report gives us a hint of what's to come. And by the way, another reason I think it's going to be a V, couple of things. One, the federal government has injected a lot of stimulus into the economy. 4 phases of stimulus so far. You might remember that during the Great Recession, after Lehman Brothers falters on September 15th of 2008, the federal government hemmed and hawed. They voted down TARP before they voted it up. You might remember the market tumult during that period. This time, they didn't waste any time. March 6th, phase 1. 12 days later, phase 2. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act, a nearly $200 billion package. Within 9 days after that, phase 3, that was the CARES Act, more than $2 trillion package. And then less than a month after that, more money for the Paycheck Protection Program and other things, nearly a $500 billion package. And my guess is one more stimulus package to come, this one targeting state and local governments. Of course, that's predicting a political outcome that's challenging. But a lot of this money is yet to hit the US economy. And here's the other thing. The US savings rate, the household savings rate, pre-crisis was around 8%. Pretty reasonable rate of savings, 8%. By April, it had risen to 33%. Why? People got that $400 check. They've been getting, some people, $600 a week from the federal government unemployment insurance on top of their state benefits. They've been stockpiling cash. They haven't had opportunities to spend. A lot of us haven't been on unemployment. A lot of us didn't get that $400 check, but we've been stockpiling cash because we were nervous and we didn't have an opportunity to spend. I mean, there's only so much Grubhub you can order in a day. So given that all that dry powder in American households on their balance sheets, given all this stimulus, it's going to be a V. That brings me to my final slide, the one forecast. The initial phase of recovery from this crisis will be sharp, profound, and most welcome. Look, as we restart this economy and as people start to re-engage the economy, whether as consumers or as workers, interest rates are still low. They're low. Pent-up demand is high, including for all kinds of things, including automobiles. You saw the initial public offering for a company called Vroom yesterday, perhaps, which is a fantastic IPO. Stock surged. These are folks who sell used cars online. But part of the reason for that is there's a lot of pent-up demand out there for all kinds of things. And there's therefore a need to rebuild inventories, including at auto dealerships. And people are anxious to meet again. Aren't you anxious to meet people again? Go to restaurants, casinos, see a movie, and not in your home and not on Netflix. Watch the Baltimore Orioles, which is the most beautiful thing a human being can do, short of nurturing a child. And engage in other most wonderful human activities. Yeah, we want to get back to it. That's part of the V. May's jobs report was an absolute stunner. One way to look at this is say economists missed the mark by 10.5 million jobs. Another kinder way to look at it is that economists missed it by 2 weeks. The economy reopened faster than we thought. And people are ready to re-engage. I see people all over the place out there, jogging and spending. You know, they've been pent up, protesting. And while the recovery has begun, believe me, these remain treacherous times, including for commercial real estate, because there is going to be a lot of vacancy coming out of this. And you heard of the, about costs of insurance and so on and so forth. So, a lot of issues there. And commercial real estate might actually be one of the later segments of the economy to really recover in earnest. But let me just set that aside and let me turn it over to Wesley now for questions. Thanks a lot.
Anirban, thanks so much, man. That was a great, thorough presentation covering a lot of topics. I know that's difficult in a short amount of time. I'm going to go ahead and just touch on some points that I picked up on your discussion here. First, actually, one of Jim's points that insurance premiums are on the rise. So anybody on the call, anybody that watches this after we post it on our social media channels, call Jim and talk about your insurance premiums here coming up in the future if you're coming up for renewals and or just switching in general. So other positive points here. The rest is all positive that I wrote down anyway, to no surprise. 10-year treasury at all-time low, great for commercial lending rates, commercial property prices using that property price index. It's at a 25-year high. The recession is over because we're already starting recovery. We will face a V-shaped recovery. So to me, that sounds like loads and loads of optimism. I'm going to go ahead and jump into some of the questions here. We do have several. I'm going to ask actually one of my own first, and then we'll get to some of the others that you've already actually touched on. But my question for you, Anirban, is specifically to the Eastern Shore. Do you have an outlook on the Eastern Shore's economy for the rest of 2020 and maybe into 2021?
Yes, right. So, the rest of 2020 is going to be like much of the rest of the country, a period of recovery. I was actually in Easton this last weekend, stayed at the Tidewater Inn, and it was very active. Hotel was really quite full. Only outdoor dining, but it was very, very busy. The stores that were open had a lot of patrons inside of them. I saw people buying apparel, for the first time in many months. Apparel was one of the hardest segments. So I would expect some recovery in agriculture as some of these commodity prices firm. And from a long-term perspective, and we talked about this before the webinar, you and I, from a long-term perspective, I would expect a lot more manufacturing to come to the Eastern Shore. And that's something to watch for. This reshoring story that we're hearing coming out of China, for instance, bringing back parts of the supply chain back to the United States, I think it's real. And we in Maryland need to get ready. And there's all kinds of barriers to having manufacturing in Maryland, including on the Eastern Shore, including the fact that we're not a right-to-work state. And for some CEOs, that's an issue. But watch for that. So I'm still very bright on the Eastern Shore economy. Final point, retirement. A lot of these city slickers from Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Washington, they want a second home now. They want a place to go to if this ever happens again so they can socially distance. So there's going to be a lot of demand for Eastern Shore property.
Great outlook there. Yeah, I know we here at SVN Miller, we're seeing a lot of activity in the marketplace. This week, I'm going to be touring with, backing up to that, before that is I personally have an influx of companies from out of state coming and looking in Maryland. I know that's a little bit of a surprise to some people, but a lot of times what we see is millionaires or large companies exiting Maryland, and especially here going to our neighboring state, Delaware, with favorable tax structures. But this week I'm touring a company from New York, and they're going to be looking at the entire Delmarva Peninsula for a new location. And so I've personally seen a lot of influx from that and a lot of momentum in the market here locally. Just for the audience, we're going to go over a little bit today from 11 o'clock. If anybody can just stay on, only because of the questions that we have coming in. And I'm only going to ask the questions that have not been covered. So those of you that have asked a question in the Q&A box that have been answered, I'm going to go ahead and skip past those, but thank you for participating. Mike Dunn asked a good question. He says, so the stock market has traditionally been a metric that we use as a determinant of our overall economic health. Is that any longer a valuable metric?
Right, great question, Mike. I'm not sure that it is. It is a reflection, I don't think necessarily of economic health, but in many cases of policymaking. So when you've got a Federal Reserve saying we'll do whatever it takes to keep the economy going, and a Federal Reserve, I think, that really cares about the stock market as a measure of its own performance, then market's going to be pushed higher relative to price earnings fundamentals. When you've got a federal government willing to shove a lot of money into the economy, now you might think that would be bad for the stock market, but the fact of the matter is that generates more transactions in the economy that ultimately translates into more retail sales, more corporate earnings, so on and so forth. There might be a long-term price to pay from that, but the stock market seems very short-term in orientation right now. And so that gives me some pause. The Dow Jones, as I'm speaking to you, is down 306 points, as it turns out. So you also got all that volatility. That's a reflection of all this policy-making noise out there. Is there going to be another stimulus and so on and so forth? The economy doesn't, well, this is an odd thing to say, the economy doesn't change that much from day to day to day. It changes from month to month lately, but not day to day to day. And yet the market is wildly volatile from hour to hour. So yeah, I think the stock market is not the reliable indicator that it once was, not the leading indicator that it once was.
Robert asked a question, I think one that's been on all of our minds, and you being a member of, was it Governor Hogan's economic development team, what do you think about the shortfall in state and local revenues and how that may manifest itself over the next several years? Are we going to see, higher taxes, a combination of various things, or are we just going to ride it out and dip into maybe our rainy day funds? What are your thoughts there?
Right. We're certainly going to dip into rainy day funds. We're already seeing that as local governments around the state are putting together their budgets. A very good example is the city of Baltimore. Some of these jurisdictions simply can't raise taxes anymore. They've raised taxes to the max, whether the property tax or literally they've raised their income tax to the max by 3.2%. So what do they have to do? They have to cut spending. What are they hoping for? They're hoping for a federal stimulus package that targets state, local governments. And there's some angst in Washington, D.C. about that, of course, because of the national debt, which is, closing probably in on $30 trillion now, but also because there's a desire not to bail out New Jersey. And I don't want to bail out New Jersey myself, or Illinois, which sends half of its governors to prison. But you can actually see when you look at state, local government finances, how much revenue they lost in March compared to February, or in April compared to February, or or in May compared to February. What they were collecting a year ago, and what they ended up collecting, and then it makes sense, I think, to backfill some of that so we don't have to cut jobs in teaching, firefighting, police officers. Though again, I don't want to get into that issue, my goodness, but local government garbage collectors. So because that will slow the recovery, and state and local governments have to balance their budget every year. That's the thing. The federal government doesn't, and the federal government can borrow at very low interest rates right now. And so we don't need to sustain this economic damage and slow the recovery. So anyway, my guess is this is a presidential election year, and so my guess is they're going to come up with a package because they need to seem sympathetic to the American people, but both parties. But yeah, that's my answer to your question. Absent that, you're going to see a lot of cutting of government spending. I don't think you're going to see a lot of tax increases. There's just no appetite for that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm having a lot of clients on our end where we manage a lot of commercial properties for investors. They're concerned, of course, they're passing along a lot of those expenses to their tenants through triple net leases, but there's a big concern of, well, everybody thinks that the knee-jerk reaction is going to be higher property taxes. And my advice to them, my at least counsel to them, is that's not going to be a very easy pass. If people are making less money and the economy's in a recession, they're probably not going to have very much support in raising property taxes. So I certainly agree with you there. Brad Hastings has a good question. He says, can you comment on your thoughts in regards to the, in regards to the relative success of remote working for corporations, and what impacts do you foresee to commercial real estate going forward?
Right. So it's a big topic of discussion, obviously, Brad, and great question. I do not think that we're at the end of office space. I don't see it. So it is true that people can work remotely, but here's the question. Are they as productive working remotely as they would be working in the office? Managers like to manage and supervisors like to supervise. And I think that what we've done as a society is we have, because of this pandemic, defined down what is a productive day. And there's just so many distractions at home. And by the way, when you're in the office, you're often working with more technology than you could be in a home. And not to mention the benefits of sharing ideas, so on and so forth. I will say that there will be some businesses who will say, why am I in a Class A building paying all this rent? One of the reasons that a lot of businesses migrate into Class A and Class A+ space is for reasons of retention and recruitment. So if the challenge is to cobble together a staffing model to bring young professionals and others into your business, I need to impress them when they come into the office for that first interview. And I want to have really nice office space as a recruitment tool. But now with the class of 2020 shattered, so many people looking for work, including recent college graduates, maybe I need to think about my rent, my monthly rent. I need to pocket some of the savings and move into class B space. And so that's something to watch for. So I think one of the things that will be impacted by this is the demand for new construction, newly constructed office buildings, newly constructed hotels, and certainly newly constructed commercial space, including retail space. But yeah, I don't think it's the end of office space. And for class B building owners, this is an opportunity to regain some lost market share. That might mean a new HVAC system, because one of the ways a virus can spread is through air handling systems. So you might have to upgrade HVAC and some other things. You need to have in public restrooms, for instance, partitions that go right to the floor, those kinds of things. Instead of having those blow dryers for your hands, because that spreads virus, you have just old-fashioned paper towel dispensers, those kinds of things. But there's an opportunity here because there's a market share shift, I think, back to class B to a certain extent.
Some great points I hadn't even personally thought of yet about the paper towel situation. We've just come so accustomed to, save the planet and go away from that. But maybe this is a scenario where we go back to that. I tend to definitely agree with you on the office space. People want to be together. I think we can all comment, even the introverts out there, where they've been sitting at home trying to work and be productive from their makeshift home office, and the cat and the dog running around and whatever distractions they have, they're certainly not productive. And I had a conversation with a client yesterday. He is personally experiencing that with his company, where some of his employees just aren't performing like they normally would. He's not blaming them, so to speak. He's more just a symptom of the situation. But also from the government level side, I won't say which government level, but he is having an extremely hard time getting permits through the system, and like they normally would. So yeah, there are some expected slowdowns, but certainly not to the level that he's experiencing. So I totally agree with you. That office space is definitely going to be here to stay. People want to be around people. It's in our nature. Go ahead and this is a question on a topic that we haven't touched on yet, coming from Jim Mathias. I'm sure you know Jim. He says, good morning, great analysis, Anirban. And he asks, are you on the Governor Hogan's recovery team? And what are your thoughts about the recovery in higher education? I know colleges and universities have certainly taken a big hit and may continue through the fall.
Well, let me just first say that Jim Mathias is a most exquisite gentleman of the highest rank and one of the finest people I've ever met, and that's true. Second thing, I'm not on the governor's recovery team. I'm not. I would love to have been, but I'm not. And then, with respect to reopening of the economy, we now have a far different situation than we had in January, February. Remember in January, February, what we were talking about, or at least February, March? Don't have enough PPE for healthcare workers. Don't have enough ventilators. Don't have enough ICU beds, intensive care unit beds. Don't have enough testing. Don't have any of this. Don't know if remdesivir, which is a Gilead Sciences drug, actually has clinical efficacy. Don't have any clinical trials taking place to find a vaccine. Now we have 150 taking place globally, a bit more than that. So we are in a position where if there's another outbreak, we can handle it. I'm not saying I want people to get this thing. I'm not saying I want more people to pass away from this thing. But is the best idea at this point to shut down the economy again if we see reinfection rates or infection rates surge? No, I don't think we have to get there. So I'm seeing that the consumer is ready to go at it. Young people, it's like nothing is even in the air. COVID-19 doesn't exist. I'm seeing them hugging and then some. So in any case, with respect to Jim Mathias' question, this recovery is going to be, I think, pretty smooth. We're still working on bulking up our testing capacity. Pfizer has been talking about a vaccine as early as the fall. So a lot to look forward to. I mean, I think look forward to 2021, Jim Mathias. It's going to be much, much better.
I'm sure he's loving to hear that with his position now at UMES. You actually answered or touched on one of the questions that someone else asked, and I don't think we have to go into it here in the interest of time, but Miss Amy Miller did ask, how did you forecast, or how do you forecast the recovery if there's a resurgence of the virus in the fall? And I think you touched on, correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't see, if we do have just call it a resurgence, whether it's a big one or a small one, you don't see them completely shutting down the economy again. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Wesley. I don't. We need to get ready for that because the virus likes cold temperatures. It likes people sneezing and coughing. It likes low humidity. There's a vulnerability there. There's no question about that. And I'm an economist, not an epidemiologist, and the epidemiologists don't even know. But I will say this from a public policy standpoint, where we'll be much better prepared in October than we were in February.
Well, that's good news, because that's what everybody, I mean, that's kind of like one of the buzzword conversations that we keep hearing, stay off the beaches, stay off the boardwalk. Of course, that's kind of hits close to home for us in Ocean City. And with you, of course, back to your Orioles. And I say your Orioles because there's not many that claim that these days.
That's a beautiful thing about the Orioles is you can socially distance at an Orioles game. We got a stadium that holds 45,000. There's only 8,000 people there. It's not an issue.
That's your best line of the day. That's a good one. So one more. We're going to go ahead and wrap this up here. We still have about 100 people still on the call, so they're hanging in with us. Let's see. Dr. Arvey. Dr. Arvey is a professor at Salisbury University here in our hometown, of course. And his question, to no surprise, is, do you expect inflation to increase above the last 10-year average in the next 3 to 4 years, given the Fed's actions? I know that's a question that a lot of our clients are also asking us. So please give us your wisdom on that one.
Well, I don't know about wisdom, but I will say this. I absolutely expect inflation. There's an equation, it's very simple. It's M times V equals P times Y. If you take the logarithm of that, it's percentage change M plus percentage change V equals percentage change P plus percentage change Y. But all it says is this, that when you increase money supply, one of two things can happen. Actually, both things can happen. But there are one or two things that can happen. Either you get an increase in output. So what you're doing is that new money supply gets in and you're absorbing that money with more output. But output is constrained right now. Why is it constrained? Well, we haven't talked about it yet, but some of this. But productivity growth, as I say, is not what it used to be. The labor force participation rate has fallen back dramatically. And it may be that a lot of these workers who lost their jobs, who entered the labor force late in this cycle, excited by these higher minimum wages, excited by, all this talk about a great economy, have now left, and that they have left permanently. That further constrains output. So if output doesn't absorb all that money, what absorbs the rest of it? It's price increases, it's inflation. So while right now in the short term, we're talking about disinflation and low interest rates, not deflation, but disinflation. In a couple of years, it would not surprise me, Wesley, if we're having a conversation about inflation. I'm not talking about 1970s, early 1980s inflation. OPEC doesn't have that kind of power over us anymore. But what I am talking about is the level of inflation that would cause the Federal Reserve to raise rates, even if the economy is not that great, even by that point, if unemployment is still significantly higher than it was pre-crisis, let's say. That's the kind of inflation I'm talking about. So thank the professor for the question, and that's my answer.
Absolutely. Just a quick tie into that answer. Could you give us a number, like a number prediction of where do you see, for example, I know in a lot of our commercial leases, as opposed to the general CPI index, rent increases is tied into the CPI Baltimore-Washington index. Do you have a prediction on what that number may be? Are we going to, I know your one slide showed 1.4% increase. Are we going to be at 4.4% increase? Are we going to go that high, kind of in that range, or what are your thoughts?
We won't go that high, but the reason we won't go that high is because the Federal Reserve will be raising rates to keep inflation under control. So if you see numbers between 3 and 4%, I think that's eminently possible, even as the Federal Reserve tightens monetary policy. That's what I'm saying. And it's a shame in some sense, right? Because that will slow the recovery at that point. So the initial stage is a V, but as I say, complete recovery, I think will prove elusive for years. And part of the reason I say that is because at some point there is the revenge of inflation coming and higher interest rates. Now, I was wrong during the previous cycle about that because I was saying, oh, unemployment's at a 50-year low, we're going to get some inflation, and we didn't. So one of the things I might be underestimating is the effect of technology and global trade in terms of mitigating inflation. But let's face it, global trade is fragmenting right now. And we're reshoring production actually to more expensive environments. That's not deflationary or disinflationary, that's inflationary. There's good reason for that, but it's still inflationary. So anyway, we can have this conversation in a couple of years. And if I'm wrong, just don't invite me back.
Well, that's the beauty that you're in. I think you say every year that your prediction tomorrow is going to be different than your prediction today. And you're the only person, or your industry are the only people that are allowed to consistently be wrong besides the weatherman. So appreciate all your input and your thoughts on that and all the other topics today. We're going to go ahead and kind of wrap this up today. We could go on and on with a ton of questions that I personally have. We have a few more left in our box that most have been covered, but in the interest of time and your time, thank you so much, Anirban. We appreciate it as always, and continuing our relationship moving forward in future events. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Mr. Miller. Brent?
Anirban, great job. Thank you for your insight and appreciate your time today. Jim, Insurance Market, thank you very much. Mario with SU, great job behind the scenes. And without our sponsors, we would not be able to put this event on. M&T Bank, Delmarva Veteran Builders, Bank of America, Hubbard Savings Bank, the Insurance Market, Bank of Delmarva, Farm Credit, Avery Hall, TRSC, CPA Group, and W.R. McCain. Also want to thank our committee members, Amy, Rick, Wes, Bunny, Steve, Kelly, Amber. And also wanted to remind everyone that most of you probably have registered and you have received our exclusive Delmarva Peninsula Commercial Real Estate Market Report that we have created exclusively for this event. This will be an annual report that we will be pushing out to the attendees of this event now and into the future. So if you have not received that, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to send that to you. Again, I'd like to thank you for attending our Commercial Real Estate Forum virtual series. Our next series will be Wednesday, June the 17th, featuring Nick from, he's with Bank of America Merrill Lynch. He's an investment strategist and chief investment officer. He is a national speaker and we look forward to his insight as well. So again, thank you for attending. As we move through this recovery, we're looking forward to that V, as Anirban predicted, and we wish you well on getting back to business. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Anirban. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody, for attending.